For those of you who are new to this webinar series and to the center's work, I'm Tejaswini Niranjana, Director of the Center for Integration Research. And I've had the enormous pleasure in the last few months of connecting to the network of South Asian scholars in Hong Kong, where I used to work. And we have together assembled this series called South Asia in the South China Sea. And I'm really glad to see so many of you here and several newcomers. Many of my colleagues from the network are here. I can just call out to Alistair McClure, Devika Shankar, Brian Choi, and one more, Leila Revaina, who couldn't be with us today. We are delighted to have Madhavi Thampi address this Zoom room. But I just want to say that the Center for Integration Research is trying to create new spaces and new ways of approaching the question of knowledge in Asia and to look at connections, connected histories, like several newer scholars are doing now, and to see whether we can articulate the questions we have about our own spaces differently. We are all resolutely against the question of methodological nationalism, as I think became evident even in the last webinar that we had. And I know that Madhavi's work is also pretty much along those lines. We're very glad to have her here. Apart from this webinar, we have another series on the Indian Ocean, which is in its second year now. That's coordinated by my colleagues Murari Jha and Safwan Amir at Ahmedabad University. And we have yet another webinar series called Perceptions of Risk in the Himalayas, which is a part of our Himalayan Asia cluster at the center. And that is coordinated by my colleague who's also here, Suchismita Das. So please do sign up to receive our mailers, and please do stay connected and join both in person and online for all the many activities that we have planned for the coming. Brian, over to you now.
All right, thank you, Teju. I'm very delighted to introduce speaker of this evening, Professor Madhavi Thampi, who is with the Institute of Chinese Studies at Delhi, and I think was the editor of the illustrious journal China Report. She works on China-India, India-China relations in the colonial era, and specifically on broadly on intra-Asian historical interactions. She's the author of Indians in China, 1800 to 1949, and is one of the authors of Narratives of Asia from India, Japan, and China, and China and the Making of Bombay. She is cataloging, I think with her many students, is cataloging materials related to modern China in the National Archives of India, a project which I'm very much indebted to. Tonight she can discuss the Chinese Seamen's wartime service corps in Calcutta, and hopefully we will get a lot of questions from those online and also those who will be joining us later on this evening. If you have questions while you are listening to Professor Thampi's discussion, please leave them on the chat box. Please, Professor Thampi.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for that introduction. And it's really nice to see you again, even though it's virtually. And I'd also like to thank the Center for Inter-Asian Research in Ahmedabad University, and particularly Tejaswini, for inviting me to participate in this webinar series, which is about the interactions or interconnections between South Asia and China, or as you say, the larger Sinosphere. I have spent the greater part of my research life exploring some of these connections in a historical perspective. As you know, in our country, official and public interest and even scholarly interest in China has been largely dominated by contemporary geopolitical and security considerations. And many people are just not aware of the other connections between our two societies. But when you do explore these, other connections, you begin to understand the depth and complexity of the relationship between India and China over the centuries, and the present day concerns over borders and strategic rivalry, while not unfounded, they fall into place. So today I'm going to focus on a little known connection between India and China, which took place during the Second World War. I'm going to talk about the thousands of Chinese seamen who thronged Indian ports in that period and the reasons for their presence here in India. We will consider the efforts to organize these sailors while in India into a Chinese Seamen Wartime Service Corps and why these failed. And we will look more closely into a riot that was staged by these seamen in Calcutta in December 1942 and its aftermath. We will see how what was essentially a dispute between Chinese seamen, their employers, who were mainly the big Western shipping companies, and the Chinese government and its representatives, played out in India, and how it was affected by the conditions then prevailing in India. I hope to show that this story was connected with and sheds light on many developments at the time. These include the unease in the wartime alliance between Britain and China, the concern of the Chinese nationalist government with its international reputation as one of the major allied powers, and in fact, the only Asian among the allied powers, the government of India's anxieties about the turbulent domestic situation in India, and the seething unrest in the Chinese community in India at that time. But most of all, we will see how even in the midst of the Second World War, which was the ultimate total war, the issues of class, livelihood, and personal safety conflicted with the claims of patriotic duty among the seamen. It is my belief that this story enables us to see just how intertwined the histories of China and India were in this period, and this was due largely to global developments. The intertwining, I'm not the only one to talk of intertwining of our histories, to my mind, seems to be a more satisfying way of understanding the connections between India and China than the framework of bilateral relations. The Second World War is a particularly fruitful period to understand the intertwining of our histories, because wartime conditions gave rise to an explosion of connections of a very diverse nature, many of them largely unregulated between India and China. The Japanese occupation of Eastern and Central China pushed the headquarters of the nationalist government there into the interior and the far west, bringing it into closer geographical proximity in some sense to India. As its supply lines by sea and through Southeast Asia were further cut off by the advancing Japanese forces, India became increasingly important to China as a source of supplies, a route of passage, and as a safe haven for Chinese stranded in different locations due to the war. Between the active theaters of war in East and Southeast Asia on the one side, and in West Asia, North Africa, and Europe on the other side, India and its port cities provided a haven of relative safety for tens of thousands of people of many nationalities, and Chinese were among the most numerous of these. This is the context in which our story of the Chinese seamen unfolds. Now, this study of mine has grown out of a personal exploration of over some years of materials on modern China in the National Archives of India, situated in New Delhi, as Brian was mentioning. I find it amazing that there is so much documentary material on China in the National Archives, which Indian scholars have hardly explored. One foreign scholar who has looked at these files to write his own story of the Chinese seamen in India is Dr. Cao Yin in Tsinghua University in Beijing, who has a chapter on them in his very well-researched book called Chinese Sojourners in Wartime Raj, which was recently published by the Oxford University Press. However, what I present today is based on my own research into the relevant files in the National Archives and my interpretation of what I have found there. So my talk today will be divided into three main parts. First, I will discuss how the war affected not just the service conditions, but the outlook of tens of thousands of Chinese seamen employed on foreign ships. Second, we will see why India became a prime location of Chinese seamen upended by wartime conditions, and examine the combined efforts of the British and Chinese authorities to deal with them. And finally, we will look at how they came this riot that happened in Calcutta, how it came about in December 1942 and what this signified. Okay, well, the problem of thousands of Chinese seamen getting stranded in Indian ports in the period under review was a direct result of the impact of World War II. Before that, Chinese seamen had been employed on foreign ships since at least the later 18th century, mainly on British, but also on Norwegian, American, French, Dutch, and other ships. At the time of the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939, they numbered about 30,000. About 20,000 of these formed about 15% of the crew serving on British merchant vessels. Initially, Chinese seamen serving on foreign ships were mostly from the Guangdong region, but later on, a number of them came to be recruited from the Shanghai area as well as Southeast Asia. On board the ships, Chinese worked mainly as stokers, firemen, greasers, and trimmers, that is, those who shoveled and fetched the coal from the bunkers. The recruitment, negotiation of contracts, and managing of Chinese crews were largely in the hands of Chinese shipping masters and ship headmen. Onshore, in the main ports which they frequented and where they bided their time in between contracts, their lives were subject to the dictates of the Chinese boarding masters who ran the hostels where they resided and from whose shops the seamen purchased what they needed. Okay, I just wanted to show a picture here. How do I get to it? Anyway, maybe I'll just
click on the image, Madhavi, it might work.
Yeah, I'm clicking on the okay. That's it. That's one of the seamen's hostels which were there in Liverpool. And here's a picture of the kind of conditions they used to be boarded up in there. After the formation of the Chinese Seamen's Union in 1921, the Chinese Seamen's Union took on some of the functions of negotiating its members' wages and service conditions. Nevertheless, their service conditions remained poor as compared to European seamen. At the onset of World War II, the pay of Chinese seafarers on British ships was only 1/5 that of their British counterparts. Apart from this disparity in wages, Chinese seamen, like their Indian and other non-Western counterparts, faced considerable discrimination and outright racial prejudice at the hands of their employers, as well as Western seamen and their unions at times. Desertion or jumping ship by Chinese seamen in foreign ports was not infrequent, though it is true that many of them took service on board ships with the intention of settling abroad and not working the return trip. Despite this, Chinese crews before World War II had the reputation among the shipping companies of being reliable, hardworking, docile, and largely self-regulating. The war and related developments threw the Chinese seamen on foreign ships into turmoil in more ways than one. Usually, the employment contracts of foreign seamen included free repatriation at the end of their contracts if they were not prepared to re-engage or take employment on some other ships. The Japanese occupation of their homeland ruled out the prospect of most Chinese seamen being shipped home for the foreseeable future, a situation which generated considerable stress among them. Standard employment contracts also obliged employers to provide maintenance at the port of terminus until such time that the seamen were repatriated or found employment on other ships. However, faced with the prospect of having to provide maintenance for their Chinese employees for a prolonged period during the war, many shipping lines chose to lighten their burden or shake it off altogether by various means. One way to do this was to offload Chinese seamen in Indian ports, where it was cheaper to maintain them than in British ports like Liverpool or other ports in the West. Authorities in Calcutta, in fact, started to worry about the city becoming what they called a dumping ground for Chinese seamen from all over the world, unquote. Another cause for discontent among Chinese crews was that they were not compensated for war risk as their Western counterparts were. by 1943, more than 1,000 Chinese seamen on British ships had been killed or were deemed missing while on duty, while 268 were prisoners of war. Let me get another picture here. Okay. British seamen were granted a war risk bonus very early in the war, but not the Chinese on British ships. A major landmark was when Chinese seamen came together to fight for a war risk bonus and also for higher rates of pay comparable to what was offered to their Western counterparts. Eventually, Chinese serving on British ships were granted a rise of pay, even though their wages still remained about 30% less than that of their British counterparts. The point here is that the conditions of war taught these seamen the importance of collective action. Even more, it generated among them the consciousness of their importance to the war effort and hence their greater bargaining power. As the war unfolded, the governments of the Allied countries, in fact, began to pay greater attention to the service conditions of the Chinese seamen due to the need to ensure a steady supply of Chinese labor to keep the ships afloat and supplies coming in. The Shanghainese recruits who joined the ranks of the Chinese seamen in greater numbers in the years just preceding the war were considered to be more troublesome or more militant, depending on the standpoint of the observer. New activists and leaders came to the fore and encouraged the seamen to take a more intransigent attitude towards the discrimination and unequal conditions that they had traditionally faced. Nevertheless, it took many months of agitation and struggle involving mass arrests and discharge of seamen for them to obtain higher wages and war risk bonus from their British employers by the middle of 1942. Despite the rise in wages and securing a war risk bonus, a large number of Chinese seamen preferred not to serve in the risky conditions then prevailing. During the war, the US changed its earlier regulations prohibiting Chinese seamen from availing of shore leave in US ports. This led to a significant rise in the number of them who jumped ship and just melted into the Chinatowns in those cities. To curb desertions and refusal to re-engage on the expiry of their contracts, the British authorities resorted to hunting them down and arresting them in large numbers. Since they could not be deported to their own country, they were threatened with deportation to India, where they were told they would be conscripted into a labor corps or even into the Chinese army regiments who were then stationed in India. So in many ways, the increasing rebelliousness of the Chinese seamen during the war was paralleled by the growing unrest among Indian seamen, the other major non-Western group serving on foreign ships. But in a couple of respects, there were major differences between the situation of Indian seamen and that of their Chinese counterparts. In the first place, repatriation of Indian seamen did not pose a problem as it did for the Chinese, who could not easily go back to their country, which was then under occupation. Secondly, the representatives of the Chinese nationalist government increasingly took on the role of advocates for a more equitable treatment of their own seamen on Allied ships. The Chinese Seamen's Union had some clout with the headquarters of the Kuomintang in China, and the Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek apparently took some personal interest in the issue of Chinese seamen abroad. Since China formally became one of the Allied powers after 1941, and a treaty between Britain and China was concluded in 1942, this meant that the Chinese seamen now had some kind of voice at the highest levels. Nevertheless, the objective of the Chinese government and its representatives abroad with respect to the Chinese seamen was twofold. On the one hand, it sought better terms of employment and conditions for their countrymen, and particularly an end to the kind of blatant discrimination that they faced. On the other hand, though, it also sought to control and regulate the large force of Chinese seamen and ensure their full participation in the Allied war effort, whether they wanted it or not. Okay, so now we come to the Chinese seamen in India and the formation of the Wartime Service Corps. So by middle of 1942, shipping companies were discharging large crews of Chinese seamen in Indian ports, mainly Calcutta and Bombay, but also Madras. One reason for this was the growing reputation of Chinese seamen, for reasons which we just touched on, as intractable and hard to manage. Equally important was the cost factor. Once the Chinese seamen had managed to secure higher rates of pay and war risk bonus. According to one report, it was more economical for shipping companies to discharge Chinese seamen and to hire in their place Indian seamen whose wages were less than those of the Chinese, even if it meant that they had at the same time to pay maintenance to the discharged Chinese employees. So, accepting the ship owners' logic that it was not possible for them to repatriate the discharged Chinese seamen in wartime, the authorities in India, the British colonial authorities, seemed resigned to the problem of suddenly having a large number of unemployed Chinese seamen on their hands. As one official noted, quote, "We cannot get rid of them at any rate until we recapture Burma. So they just have to remain, and somehow or other they have to be fed," unquote. About 3,200 of these seamen were stranded in Calcutta, while another 1,800 or so were in Bombay. The authorities in India also appear to accept that the shipping companies were not obliged to honor their commitment to pay for their employees' maintenance until their eventual repatriation. This, however, was not accepted by a good number of the seamen who insisted on fulfillment of the terms of their contract. Discontent among them was rife. The authorities in Calcutta were anxious about how to maintain and regulate such a large body of stranded seamen. Even more, they worried about the impact of such a sizable number of restless seamen on the already volatile situation in Calcutta's Chinatowns. Their concern was shared by the Chinese government and its consular representatives in India. It was under these circumstances that the governments of the UK, India, and China came up with the scheme to set up a labor corps composed of these seamen. The Chinese Seamen's Wartime Service Corps was formally inaugurated in Calcutta on 22nd October 1942. According to the agreement between the Indian authorities and the Chinese official representatives, the cost of maintaining it would be borne by the government of India, while the management and disciplining of the corps would be handled by the Chinese government. The idea behind this corps was that it would serve as a ready supply of labor for various purposes while keeping the seamen gainfully employed and out of trouble. But the whole scheme ran into roadblocks right from the beginning and threatened to unravel. In the first place, the scheme did not find easy acceptability among the seamen themselves. They saw themselves first and foremost as sailors employed on a contract, and they were not prepared to let their ship owners off the hook so easily. They insisted on repatriation, even by air, if China's sea coasts were blocked by the Japanese, failing which they demanded maintenance according to the stipulated terms until their repatriation. They also insisted that they were professional seamen and not coolies to be assigned to any work given to them. At the very least, they saw themselves as skilled or semi-skilled workers and demanded to be treated as such. At the same time, they objected to a proposal to send them to the forward areas near the front in Assam, because by that time the Japanese had invaded Burma and Assam was right on the front. They did not want to be treated as cannon fodder, as they said, insisting that they were merchant seamen and not soldiers. Yet another difficulty was the lack of clarity on how the men in the corps were to be employed. Initially, the US Army Service of Supply, which was stationed in that part in India as part of the China-Burma-India theater of operations, they appeared to have offered to use the men. They later apparently backtracked on this offer. Meanwhile, the General Staff of the Army expressed its unwillingness to use a group of disgruntled men anywhere near the front in Assam. The organizers of the corps then fell back on the idea of using the Chinese seamen in Calcutta at the docks and similar establishments. This plan too founded on the objections raised that this would be seen as taking away Indian jobs at a time when there was adequate Indian labor. It was also felt that employing Chinese workers at higher wages than that given to Indian workers would have a demoralizing and even incendiary impact on Indian labor. The lack of consensus and coordination among the different allies and departments threatened to scuttle the whole project. Hugh Waitman, who was then secretary in the External Affairs Department of the Government of India, deplored that what he called an unemployable labor corps, quote, costs us well over 12 lakhs a year, and we have been hard put to it to get any value whatsoever out of them. The army won't have them in forward areas, and labor objected to their being employed in most of the backward areas, unquote. Even more frustrated were the China relations officers posted in Calcutta who had overall responsibility for handling matters related to Chinese in India. Accusatory mails and notes flew back and forth between the different authorities over the question of what to do with the Chinese seamen. Meanwhile, the Chinese officials were also deeply involved. Unlike the Indian authorities, who felt that there was a limit to how much coercion they could use against Chinese seamen who had not violated any laws while they were in India, the Chinese consular representatives felt that they had the moral authority as well as the political authority derived from their government at Chongqing to insist that their countrymen join the labor corps. In the words of the then Consul General at Calcutta, C.J. Pao, he said, quote, my government will not allow good and healthy Chinese nationals wasting their lives in such a time, as every ounce of energy must be devoted in productive and useful service, unquote. Pao was particularly adamant that what he saw as the pernicious practice of gambling in the city's Chinatown area be curbed, and he believed that it was the root of the evil among the insubordinate Chinese seamen. These are just a couple of images of mahjong, playing, gambling, mahjong, and opium dens in Calcutta at the time, during this period. The situation was complicated by information received from Bombay that the 1,800 Chinese sailors who were stranded in that port were also becoming restless. The idea of forming another labor corps from amongst them was first considered and then dropped, probably because of the difficulties of getting the already launched labor corps in Calcutta operational. A plan to send the whole lot of them across by train from Bombay to join their peers in Calcutta was also mooted, but does not seem to have been followed up. Meanwhile, the situation became more urgent when it was reported by the Indian government's Chinese intelligence wing, which had been set up by that time, that leading agitators among the seamen in Calcutta were contacting their peers in Bombay and encouraging them to also take an adamant stand about their rights to maintenance and repatriation. So now we come to the riot of 4th December 1942. So despite the best efforts of all the authorities concerned, only 728 seamen, that is less than 1/4 of all the seamen in Calcutta, had shown any willingness to join the corps when it was formed. In order to pressurize the rest, it was announced that the maintenance provided to them by the shipping companies would cease on 1st November of that year. This announcement generated considerable resentment among the seamen, and about 300 of them went on the rampage in the Chinatown area, causing some damage to a restaurant, boarding house, and other establishments. It was the Chinese consular representatives, rather than the officials of the Bengal government or government of India, who seem to have taken the lead from this point on to drive the seamen to join the corps using carrot and stick methods. There were several possible reasons for this. One was that it may have been presumed that appeals to the seamen from their own fellow nationals, framed in the language of patriotic duty, would carry greater weight with them. It also seems to have weighed with the Indian authorities that in the event of their having to apply force against the seamen, they had little means of distinguishing between the seamen and other members of the Chinese community in the Chinatowns of Calcutta. But the most important consideration seems to have been that the Chinese consular representatives had been given authority by their government to apply China's strict conscription laws to the seamen and to draft them, if necessary, into the Chinese forces stationed in Ramgarh, in what is today's Jharkhand state, then Bihar state. So the prior existence of Chinese armed forces in India at this time was in fact viewed as a key to solving the problem of the Chinese seamen, once it became clear that the majority would not willingly join the labor corps. These regiments were formed from those Chinese forces that were compelled to retreat into Northeast India when the Japanese took control of Burma in mid-1942. By a joint agreement of the Nationalist government of China, the US and the UK governments, these forces, numbering about 9,000 initially, were relocated to a former prisoner of war camp at Ramgarh in India. While the government of India somewhat reluctantly took responsibility for their maintenance, the Americans were responsible for their training and equipment, and the Chinese government was in charge of discipline and management of the troops. The idea was to use this force, when feasible, as part of the Allied campaign to retake Burma. Over several months, more Chinese troops were flown into India to augment the strength of what came to be called the Chinese Expeditionary Force, bringing it to a total of over 50,000 men. Shortly after the Wartime Labor Corps was inaugurated, in a letter to the government of India, the Chinese Consul General, whom we mentioned earlier, C.J. Pao, proposed rounding up those seamen who refused to join the Corps and sending them to Ramgarh. Drafting the seamen into the Chinese Expeditionary Force, he thought, would solve several problems at once. It would ensure their maintenance for the duration of the war. It would remove this insubordinate mass from the rest of the Chinese population of Calcutta, and it would provide additional able-bodied men to the Chinese armed forces. The problem here was one of conveying such a large number of men under escort to Ramgarh from Calcutta. Doubts were expressed about the capacity of the Calcutta police to round up such a large number all at once. The Chinese authorities were willing to bring down enough personnel from Ramgarh to remand the seamen under escorts back to Ramgarh. However, the idea of having a body of Chinese troops land up in Calcutta did not appeal to the Indian authorities. Well, the deadline of 1st November, when their maintenance payments were stopped, came and went without any major disturbance. But still, the undercurrents of discontent among the seamen did not dissipate. They continued to agitate and at various times resorted to demonstrating outside the consulate and besieging the shipping master. The whole situation was fraught with such tension that Consul General Pao apparently suffered a heart attack and had to relinquish his duties. On the morning of 4th December, a few hundred seamen gathered again to protest outside the Chinese consulate. While the main leaders went upstairs to talk with the consular officials, others harangued the gathered protesters and roused their emotions. At this juncture, the police arrived and, on being given the go-ahead by the consulate, blocked off the main exits from the area and charged and tear gassed the protesters. A violent confrontation ensued. Apart from the 6 leaders who were arrested and kept separately, a total of 412 people were rounded up. A few managed to escape into the Chinatown area. It is interesting that despite the confrontation, the Calcutta Police Commissioner felt that the seamen were neither subversive or dangerous, as he said, but only agitated about their money and service conditions. With the incident of 4th December, the organized resistance of the Chinese seamen apparently collapsed. Those rounded up were sent under armed escort to the Chinese army camp at Ramgarh, while the 6 leaders were arrested and tried, and 3 of them were later deported to China. Resistance thereafter took the more passive form of desertion. By the following year, 300 out of the 400 seamen who had been sent to Ramgarh had deserted, with the majority of them reappearing in Calcutta, and some of them even claiming that they had been dismissed from Ramgarh. An opportunity to deploy the seamen who had registered with the Labor Corps came after the Japanese began their bombing raids on the Calcutta docks on 20th December 1942, sending much of the city into a panic. The Japanese raids continued intermittently into January and led to an exodus of the Indian labor employed on the docks. The resulting shortfall of labor was sought to be met with recruits from the Chinese Labor Corps. However, by the time they have another picture here of the docks at that time. Yeah, this is with American military police and Indian labor, Chinese labor. Over the following weeks and months, there was by the time the problems that arose from the conditions of service of the Chinese seamen and the rates of pay could be sorted out, the situation of the bombing situation eased up and Indian labor came trickling back to the docks. Over the following weeks and months, there was an incremental but steady loss of personnel from the Chinese Seamen's Labor Corps. In a note dated 1st April 1943, the China Relations Officer then remarked that there was, quote, a steady shrinkage of numbers in the camps. This week, 16 men left for other employment, and the average for the previous 3 weeks was about 40. If this process goes on, he said, we shall be left eventually with a residue of a few old and infirm sailors, unquote. Discontent with their conditions apparently still ran deep among the seamen. A report from the intelligence branch quoted one of them as saying, quote, "We seamen joined the Corps for the benefit of our own welfare, but not only do we not receive any benefit, but the Corps is detrimental to our future." Probably they felt it was detrimental because when shipping lines, if they started re-employing Chinese seamen, they felt that they would be trapped in this Corps and wouldn't be able to take another contract. By the end of November 1943, the number of men in the Corps was only 426. The Chinese government ceased to object to men leaving the Corps and supporting themselves in any way that they could outside. It also began the process of downsizing the Corps, closing down its town office and recalling some of its officers back to China. By early 1945, with the end of the war in sight, the issue of repatriating the seamen to China once again came to the fore. Eventually, after the war was over, most of the Chinese seamen in India were sent back to China. So this brings to an end the story of the Chinese seamen in India during the Second World War. The Chinese seamen and their confrontation with British and Chinese authorities in India challenges the narrative of all-out war, with all the citizens being mobilized to fight the enemy that has dominated accounts of World War II, both in China and more generally. It appears that in the case of these seamen, class issues, the fulfillment of their contracts by their employers, trumped nationalist appeals. It is clear that the language of patriotic duty did not find much resonance among a large number of seamen who were more concerned with their safety and livelihood. Rather, the conditions of war gave them a greater sense of their own importance and of the need to organize and fight for their rights. At the same time, the congregation of thousands of Chinese seamen in Indian ports at this time also tells us much about how the war changed how India and China stood in relation to each other. Far from being a distant place for China, India during the war became relatively close and relatively accessible. This was true both for Chinese authorities seeking desperately to source badly needed civil and military supplies, as well as for individual Chinese fleeing occupation and hardship. While sea routes were mostly closed, the overland routes through Tibet and Xinjiang and the air passage over the dangerous hump, as it was known, were open. India became the back door, or you could call it the gateway to China, as it were. Because India was not a site of major military action during the war, except for the extreme northeastern part, it was also a place of relative safety for Chinese stranded and unable to go home or proceed to other places where fighting was intense. Another factor was the presence of the Chinatowns, particularly in Calcutta. These offered Chinese who found themselves in India a familiar place to stay, as well as jobs or businesses, both legal and illegal, that allowed them to sustain themselves. As Cao Yin, whom I had talked about earlier, Dr. Cao Yin has pointed out in his book, the increased presence of Chinese during the war and the active interest that the Chinese authorities took in them was a source of mounting anxiety and suspicion for the Indian authorities. Nevertheless, military exigencies and the need to maintain the wartime alliance between Britain and China meant that during the war, these suspicions and anxieties were papered over, and Chinese sojourners in India were not too closely regulated or harshly dealt with. The result was that the wartime years presents a picture of lively and diverse interactions between India and China on multiple levels that were unprecedented in the modern era and which have not really been replicated since then. Thank you. I think that's long. Yeah.
This talk give us a very complicated picture of the ways in which this seamen, which we'll hope we'll discuss more about later on in the discussion, as to how like various enterprises and government authorities try to regulate them, mobilize them, and how they were sort of try to be inducted into various enterprises by different nation states, and also be controlled, managed by colonial authorities in India. So this is a really sort of specific group, which I suppose it's very sort of ephemeral. I mean, they last for like what 1940. The title of the talk sort of it sort of homes into the 2 years, 1942 to 1944. So assume that most of them actually went back to where they came from and did not really stay. So that reason is a very sort of a fleeting legacy, which we cannot sort of very much recover. But the question that I was like asked more of an information than anything else is whether there were sort of recollections done by the seamen or on with by themselves or recorded by other authorities of their experiences in India or through England to India, and how and experiences in India, in Calcutta, and that would be rather interesting because I obviously I don't know. My knowledge of this seamen is very limited compared to yours. But is in the archive, national, in sort of official archives, all you see is what officials and what consular officials and who dealt with them, and it's really hard to see how these people actually live their lives. I mean, but then obviously there are limitations. It's very difficult as to see. I suppose how they manage to communicate with one another, with the local Chinese population, whether they spoke the same dialects and so on, or how if they were literate and so on, did they write anything back to their families in China, in Southeast Asia, and so on. So perhaps this is my first question, if I may. The second question, if I could say so, is the thing you said about the motivations as to why they went all the way either to England or to India was obviously because they were supposed to be, they were making money. They were trying to seek safe haven. They were trying to seek a living for themselves and to sustain the livelihood for themselves and their families. And how did it occur to Chinese consul officers that these people could be recruited into a regiment to support the Allies' efforts? I mean, that seems rather strange to me, unless they were willing to give a sort of a much better back package than they already had with existing employers. Or if they were unemployed, then probably that would be an interesting prospect. Otherwise, it's hard it just struck me as strange that they would think of such a proposal as to mobilize this limited, amount of human resources. So I think that's I will stop here, and I would encourage the audience to either get ready and turn on your microphone, or to type your questions on the chat box. Thank you.
So shall I respond to you first, Brian?
If you may, if you want,
your point about whether there are any records, in which the seamen speak in their own voices rather than through the intelligence reports and other reports. I mean, that's very important. And if I expand this, one definitely has to look at that. Besides the records here in the National Archives of India, in the National Archives of India, you don't find anything other than, certain quotations like intelligence reports saying that this is what a seaman said. This has nothing to do with it. But you don't really get a sense of their voice. There are a number of records in the archives of the Academia Historica in Taiwan. And Seamen has consulted those records. But those are, of course, also not really, from what I can see from his chapter, those are also the records of officials of the Chinese authorities, Chinese party officials. They also are viewing the seamen as an object, as a problem. And so since I have not looked at those myself, though I would like to at some time, I cannot say that whether there are records, where the seamen themselves wrote. But this is definitely something that one should look at, to see whether there are some of their own voices. I mean, that would be really a find if we find something like that. But there are a little more, you get a sense of their personal circumstances from the seamen who were in Liverpool, and in Britain. Recent years, there's been a little bit of a interest in those seamen because the whole lot of them were deported from Britain. Just at the end of the war, many of them had families there, and they were literally rounded up and sent back. And sometimes even their families didn't quite know where they were taken till much later. So in connection with that, if you just Google, you will find a lot on something about so generally about the seamen, their conditions during the war and what they had to go through. You find more among the seamen who were in Britain, but among the Chinese seamen who were in India at that time, I have not seen anything really like what you were talking about. About your second question, how the consular officials could think of, rounding up these seamen and using them. Isn't that what you were talking about?
Yeah.
And, again, I come back to Seamen, who has he has a thesis in his book where he says that, the main consideration of the Chinese government at that time was to uphold its international reputation. Okay, so on the one hand, they were against all these forms of discrimination in pay and service conditions and so on. But on the other hand, they felt it was, it would uphold the prestige of China as one of the allied powers. The seamen should be involved in doing something useful, like I quoted from that consul general. They should be. It's intolerable to think that there should be people wasting their time in Chinatowns, gambling dens, and opium dens, and they should be put to productive use. So I think there was a very strong feeling that Chinese at that time everybody should be taken into the war effort, and should not be. But that is the narrative which is challenged precisely by the story of the Chinese seamen, that they did not see themselves as first and foremost people who had to fight for the they saw themselves as people who were actually being victimized. And just when they had started to get a sense of their own strength and their own power and their own rights, these were being denied to them in the name of national duty. And so it's interesting that they didn't seem to buy those arguments of the consular officials. But it looks to me like, from what you see in that the consular authorities took this very seriously. They referred everything back to the government in Chongqing, and they got their orders directly from. It was not that they were acting on their own. They got their orders, from Chongqing about how to handle the seamen. So
Right. Yeah. I saw those documents myself when I
Yeah.
was doing my research in Taiwan. I was sort of I couldn't make any sense of
Mm.
why they put so much effort on a very limited number of men who were in India. They were not trained in military affairs. I mean, they were not part of the military service. It's just that it's quite it's. I mean, if I may, I just wanted to mention one point, and I will sort of segue to the audience. You mentioned how the Chinese consular officers of the consulate were more interested in the welfare of the seamen. They wanted to speak on behalf of them. When did those seamen, when they had trouble, did it first occur in their mind that they could go to the consulate, or did they go to other people?
Well, I think the fact that they kept on holding demonstrations outside the consulate and that they were actually talking to the consular officials, but maybe belligerently, but still talking to the consular officials. I think, there was this feeling that the government should uphold their rights. Like they couldn't see why they should not get what was due to them. I think that was very clear, and they felt that the consular officials should help them in that. While they looked at it differently, they saw it as a loss of prestige, maybe a loss of face in front of the British, who were their allies. That there were these men who were refusing to serve on board the ships or in labor corps or in the army. And that's the way they looked at it. But I think there was this there were expectations that the seamen had of the Chinese authorities, precisely because of the background of earlier, where the Chinese Seamen's Union had connections with the Kuomintang and the
Right. That's very interesting, because I mean, traditionally work with when I was an graduate student, when people had trouble, they would first go to the clan organizations, and overseas they go to whichever locale then that has some form of presence in the location.
But they did blend. They did blend into the Chinatown, so that is. They did get some sustenance while they were there in the Chinatown. They were also sort of sheltered by some people, and but they were also not timid. They were themselves a bit like gang leaders in some of them in the Chinatown. They were well organized. They were belligerent. But they also so it was the consular officials on the one hand as a group of sailors, but on the other hand, the Chinatown was a kind of place they could get some support from maybe local businessmen and others. Yeah,
I see. So they're very resourceful in this sense.
Yeah. So that there was, from both sides, there was some backup to them.
Okay, I think I've taken up too much of Professor Thampi's time and everybody's time. So please, those of you who are waiting, don't be shy, and just speak up or write on the chat box.
I think Tejaswini has her hand.
Yeah, no, I'll jump in before Alistair, because he's continuing the line of questioning that Brian had started. I was also very curious about the relationship between the seamen, who don't really know where they're from in China, or whether they're from Southeast Asia, as Brian hinted, and the relationship between them and the Chinese in Chinatown, who'd obviously been there for quite some decades by then, and were primarily from southern China. So I think Brian had also raised the question of like what language or dialect did they speak, and again I'm curious. And also the question of the brotherhood, the clans. who, especially in Southeast Asia, they were the ones who were able to source labor, to bring them in. There's always a connection between those groupings, which provided the legitimate like social structure, if you like, under which everyone functioned. So in a sense, the seamen are an anomaly, right? Because they did not migrate of their own free will. They did not come via the brotherhoods. They, for some reason, have an affiliation with the government, the KMT government. So in a sense, when they did engage with locals in Chinatown, who were like more Indian than Chinese, if you like, from what we know of them, I'm just curious. I know you don't have the archival evidence to indicate what the relationship might have been like, but do you have any idea of where these Chinese seamen were from? Are there any records to prove that? So we can speculate a little further about their lack of communication or not.
More specifically than saying that they were mostly from the Guangdong and Shanghai areas, like more specifically their district or village, that I don't know. I don't have that information yet. And also from Southeast Asia. I mean, they were recruited also from there. So, so whether there would have been, place affiliations, native place affiliations between them and some of the people who were in the Chinatowns. I mean, that I can only speculate that there would have been some, because it was a fact that look, out of these 3,200 who were there, and like by the end there were hardly 200-300 who were in the labor corps. All the rest were managing somehow. They melted somewhere, and they clearly could melt really only into the Chinatown. So few we know sort of did make it back, but I think there were very few, who went through Assam to the point which is known as Hell's Gate, and entered through Burma and got out that way. But I don't think that was the majority. I think the majority just took up some kind of job or dhanda, as we would say in India. And from what I've seen, I think that is more from Tsoyon's book. They had organized, gangs also, and which were under some, they had some welfare names. They weren't called gangs or like a brotherhood. So, there were some societies, but they were. Some of the seamen were involved in these kind of gangs, sometimes extorting money from businesses, but sometimes they were just protected by businessmen, given jobs by them. This is so they really melted into Chinatown, and they were able to. So that whole relation, really what was going on in Chinatown at that time, because we knew there's a massive expansion in the population of Chinatown in that period. I mean, for over 1 century, I think the population was hardly, maybe between 10,000 or so, 5 to 10,000. And during the war, it was like up to 40,000 or so. So there was people coming from all over. So as you say, the seamen didn't come directly. They were not migrants, as Brian was saying. They didn't come themselves directly. But there were a whole lot of people who did come through Tibet, through Yunnan, Tibet, into India, northeastern India, and into Calcutta. The seamen landed in this way. But still, it was like a big melting pot there. And it's an interesting situation there.
Thank you. Alastair, would you like to join in?
Sure. Thanks for that. It was really, really fascinating. I have 2 questions. The first thing, I guess, kind of building on the previous questions, I'm kind of interested that you mentioned that there didn't seem to be an anxiety over there being, or the kind of the protests or the riots being subversive. And it's really interesting that's the case, because like you talked about a very large new community coming into a migrant community coming in, being able to blur with existing Chinatowns, so they're difficult to regulate their mobility, involved in sort of various forms of potentially criminality. There's nationalist movement happening. It's wartime, so there's all these anxieties you would think about subversion. And so, I guess the first question is, why do you think that there wasn't that anxiety about potential subversive politics in this community? And then the second question was about the kind of the authority of the government of India to, what was the kind of the width of agency or autonomy that the government of India had over receiving or not receiving the community? Because you talked a lot about them being very reluctant, or being a problem and them being reluctant. And I think outside of wartime, there would be some authority to say, we're not taking these people, right? They're not. So was it that the wartime meant that they had the imperial government said, these community are coming and you're going to have to deal with it? Or did they have any agency in saying, we don't want to, we can't receive these people at this time? Or, yeah, so I guess the question was, how much autonomy did the government of India had, or maybe local governments had, in receiving or not receiving these sorts of communities in the war?
Okay. Your first question, there was a lot of anxiety about the Chinese coming in. So you are right about that. This was just a particular assessment of the police commissioner about those seamen who had been rounded up after that demonstration, saying that they really, they're not really subversive, so dangerous. They want their wages, they're like striking for their rights. But about the anxiety, it was absolutely real. And if you ask me, the whole paranoia about Chinese in India, which is there and has continued, has its origins in this period, really, and not just after 1962, 1960s onwards, what we think. I think because this is the period when even though the British government, the colonial government, sort of knew, I would say, that even during the war, that some point that end of their rule is in sight, but they were very worried about the Chinese. This is when the Chinese intelligence wings was formed, intelligence branches were formed, or detailed reports on Chinese community, on on individuals, every hundreds of individuals in the. So there was a lot of anxiety to do with the not just with the extensive presence of Chinese for the first time in India, but also the interest of the Chinese government in those Chinese in India. So, even the Kuomintang, Brian, this is Brian's subject actually, but Kuomintang formed branches of the the party in India. Chinese schools were set up and they were suspected of being, things, and they were suspected of having links with Indian nationalist leaders. So there was a lot of anxiety, and this was just a particular reference to those individuals involved in that riot. About whether the local authorities in India had sort of any say in how, how to deal with the Chinese. Is that what you're saying? Who were there, who landed up, who were there, and how to act, how to handle them? Is that what you were asking?
Well, I was wondering, because they've been repatriated or deported, and so often the receiving country, the receiving state would have some. It costs money, right, to take it and to have any autonomy over the decision for them to be moved to India at all.
No, I think the main decision about letting them be in India, actually, I think that was definitely at a very high level from London. So it was not just the British, the shipping companies were just offloading them in India, and I don't think the local authorities had any say in rejecting them. They had to take them in. And there was a treaty signed between Britain and China in 1942 also, which sort of regulated some of these aspects of, so I think they really couldn't do anything much. And plus they had to maintain something of this wartime alliance. Incidentally, it's the Americans also were trying to deport them to India, because as I was mentioned, some of the Chinese sailors tried to jump ship in America, but they were rounded up by American authorities. And, I have some of these documents there in the American Archives, Office of the Historian, or whatever it's, where they say that, they're going to send these people from New York and other places to Ramgarh, where the Chinese army was in India. So there was this kind of network. And I don't think the local authorities could do anything except, maybe plead for more resources to handle them and, raise concerns. Like they didn't like the idea of Chinese troops coming to Calcutta, for instance, because they are supposed to be in Ramgarh and very much confined there. So those kind of issues they could raise, but I don't think they could challenge the overall policy.
Okay, I think we have Naina M.
Naina Manjrekar, yeah, she has done really a lot of work on Indian seamen. She's done her.
Apologize if I butchered the pronunciation.
No, not at all. Thank you, Dr. Thampi, for a really rich and fascinating
paper.
To see nice to hear your talk as well. I have so many questions, but I'll try and kind of limit myself to maybe three. One, sort of taking off from what Alistair was asking about the subversion of fears of subversiveness among these Chinese seamen. And whether, given that this is happening in 42 and the Quit India movement, and there are these large-scale public processions happening, whether we have any evidence of Chinese seamen interacting with, Indian nationalist movements or propaganda, whether that's being reported on in any way. The other sort of questions I had were on the nature of the labor corps. So the fact that they're not being used as combatant forces, whether there is a kind of discussion on what kinds of labor to put them to, and whether there are considerations of drawing on their skills as firemen and stokers to be used in kind of, Chinese seamen in London famously kind of work in laundries where they have to fuel furnaces to raise steam. And given the kind of, importance of steam power, whether their skills as firemen and stokers are used as part of this labor corps. And another question I had was whether there is any evidence of contact with Indian seamen, either from working on the same ships or through the kind of proximity of Chinatown and Calcutta to the Khidirpur docks. And, these are kind of similar and overlapping spaces in the kind of docklands. And just one more question, if I can kind of slip it in, is what kinds of provisions was the Indian government kind of seeking to deport them on? So were they using kind of undesirable aliens acts? Because I know there's a student in IIT Mandi who's working on the Chinese community in Assam, which goes back to the 1920s, and who worked also in coal mines. So again, sort of similar kinds of labor skills that they were using and employed in. And they, after the Indochina War, get classed as citizen aliens. And so how, under what kinds of provisions is the government of India seeking to classify these Chinese seamen and deport them?
Okay, that's
sorry.
Good questions. And I
as many
had
as
a
you
feeling
can.
that you would ask this question about whether there was interaction between the, well, your first and third questions. Basically, whether there was any interaction between the Chinese seamen and the Indian conditions or the Indian local Indian society, as well as with Indian seamen, right? That's your third question, I think. Can I take them together a little bit? Because actually it's a very good question, but I don't have any evidence of so this is something one has to look into, of their interactions. I'm sure there are a lot of books you would know best on, both Indian seamen and Chinese seamen in merchant seamen. Maybe in those books, if I go back and look more carefully, you would see if there was some sort of interaction between them as seamen. But for this purpose, I haven't really come across that. And while they were rioting and being there in India, I have not seen any connection between Indian seamen and them. Only this worry that Indian labor, if they're going to be used as labor in India, it's going to be resented by Indian labor, because Indian labor would not be paid at the same rates as Chinese labor. So this is the kind of thing. Nor have I seen any thing of them. Well, as you know, 1942, a lot of the nationalists were in jail. And so I've not seen any thing about them interacting with Indian political figures or getting any support from Indian nothing like that. This was also in February 1942, if I'm not mistaken, is when Chiang Kai-shek visited India. That was his only foreign visit. And, that was not, though the British had to accept him and, treat him as a state guest and all that, they were not very happy altogether, because he reached out to, Indian Congress leaders as well as others. So they were in a fidgety mood, the British, about any Chinese overtures to any connections between Indians and Chinese. But I haven't seen anything in the case of these Chinese seamen having any direct links. But that's something that needs to be investigated for sure. Then your second question was about whether the seamen, whether there was any effort to use their skills, right? And from what I could see from the files, they were desperate to put them in anything, and in fact, the seamen were saying, we are skilled workers, we are sailors. I don't think they would have had objection to being employed with their skills, but they could not find any appropriate way to utilize them. And so they were sent to docks for loading, unloading, and things like that, which is not really what they had been trained for. And they were never very long in any place, because when something happened, then they were pulled out. So I think, the suitability of their employment was one of their grouses. They were not given suitable employment that suited their training or their condition, their self-image of what they were. But there was this desperation. So there's a file this thick in the National Archives about the seamen, and most of it is like, what do we do with them? Where do we send them? Where do we place them? We don't want them, we don't want them, we don't want them. This kind of thing. And especially because they were organized and belligerent, so we don't want anything to do with them. So this is the kind of feeling I got. And so about under what provisions they were, So actually these seamen were not deported, except for 3 of them who were considered ringleaders of this riot. Main problem was that the ways of transporting anybody to China at that time were very limited. I mean, so that was the thing. So whoever came and landed up, any Chinese who came, landed up in India, they couldn't get rid of them, because how are you going to send them back? You can't ship them back. If you were going to escort them by rail all the way to the, border points through Tibet, and, Tibet didn't want any, by the way, Tibet had a certain autonomy at that time, and so they refused actually to let people, but people still drifted through Tibet into India. So, but the British couldn't really send them back. So these were considered as actually allies, subjects who were stranded in India, and they had to be allowed to be there. And if they would just sort of melt into, like in Bombay, it looks like the authorities were quite happy if they just melted into, supported themselves in any way and didn't give trouble. In Calcutta, I think because the numbers were large and they were more organized, so it was a problem. But even then, they couldn't deport them. All they could do was to agree to have them sent either to Ramgarh to join the Chinese army there, or try to keep them unsuccessfully in a labor corps. So that they were sent back really only after the war ended, and they weren't really deported. I don't really know the exact process of how they went back, but it was clear that that file was pretty close. They had gone back, except for maybe some who stayed on, I don't know, in Chinatown. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Thampi, we have a few questions on
Okay.
the chat box. I'm not sure. Are you able to look
See them?
into
Yeah.
them? There's Patricia Roy, who's
Hello,
your longtime
Patricia.
colleague, and then there's Cho C. He has he or she, I'm sorry, has a question on the impact, and then there's one from Aparajaf on whether any Chinese personnel, if when any Chinese personnel participated in other aspects of
Okay. Yeah, maybe
life
I'll
in
just
Chinese. Well, yeah,
I can see the question, so I can just. How much time do we have?
I think we have 10 more minutes.
Okay. I'll just try to answer briefly. Yeah, as Patricia, thank you for the question, Patricia. As you said that, what's there in the archives are all the official views, but one will have to look in the, the press.
The press coverage.
Yeah, the press, which I haven't done. If I develop this particular subject further, I would. As I said, this is something I came across while having a broader picture of what was going on between India and China during World War II. That's the area that I've been sort of looking at. And then, it just came across, what was this Chinese Seamen's Wartime Service Corps doing in Calcutta? And that's how I got into this. But really, yeah, one could fruitfully mine, I think, the Statesman and, various other Calcutta papers, at least at that time. And also maybe look in the West Bengal State Archives, probably would have much more detailed.
Could I come in with a couple of extra questions on that? That was the first one, when you explained that you didn't have the sort of personal narratives, or all your sources were the official ones. So what about the press? What about other?
There was also a strict censorship at this time, right? Yes. So, there was this Chinese Journal of India, which was there for a number of years. I think in some form or the other, it continued for many years, which was a paper. There were, in fact, 6 or 7 papers produced in the Chinatown in Calcutta. So, but what I do know is that they were under strict censorship. So, in fact, there were many times where they said that, this is, not helpful to the war effort, and they should be warned for printing articles saying this, and their paper supply will be cut, and newsprint will not be supplied to them if they don't. So one can look at the papers at that time, but I'm sure you would have had articles go through wartime censorship. So that's one.
Sure, but then you can't have a riot without everyone
without everybody knowing about it. Yeah,
but say something and blame someone.
Yeah, one should look into that. I think that's something where you'll get maybe another angle, or at least maybe a more human kind of.
Well, could I throw in a couple of other quick questions, Mr. Chair? The first is you've talked about a presence also of seamen in Bombay. You're thinking about the relationship between the two, but would you like to carry that particular thing not only as a political question, but in personal in more social terms? Would you like to comment or explore that further? I mean, what was happening in Bombay, what parallels it had with Calcutta, what communications they may have had with each, and so that was one other question that came to mind. And the third one was the question of paranoia about Chinese populations settling down or need to be sent to some other place. This was, the paranoia against sort of yellow peril. It was already many decades long, particularly through the British Empire, in America as well. Immigration restrictions, things about gold rushes, mining, and so on in all the British colonies. So, and the beginning had already been made of racial legislation in most of the English-speaking countries against Chinese in particular immigration. It was a great fear. And so the fact that, in fact, what is amazing is that the paranoia was not much greater, considering what had been happening for half a century elsewhere in the world and in British colonies. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. About the Bombay seamen and their story, as opposed to this is really about the Calcutta seamen. Oh. Yeah, one could definitely look into that. It doesn't. The Bombay seamen don't come through so much in the National Archives files, because I think they did not manage to create the kind of disturbance that the Calcutta seamen did. Only there were, as I say, there was talk of restlessness among them. But I think if you went to the Maharashtra State Archives maybe, or the you would or the as you said, the press even in Bombay, then maybe one could get an idea whether there was what the ties were between them, because we know that they were communicating with each other. Now, communicating with each other from these two different parts of India, that meant that there are some links and some lines. So what were those? That could be definitely, actually, all these are very helpful if one wants to, develop this further. So that's something that could be looked into. About the paranoia issue, yeah, you're right. The yellow peril time onwards, particularly from Boxer Rebellion period onwards, is paranoia about China and Chinese in the West. That was there. But I think the paranoia that is coming to the fore in this period has more to do with the nation state issues. Because there was this fear of what China is going to do at the end of the war, the claims that it is going to make at the end of the war. And it's clear that everybody, right from at least from 42 onwards, were jostling for their positions in a post-war settlement, or what the post-war was. That included Tibet and Xinjiang and the whole border area. So I think while there is the general racial paranoia, about in this period, there were very specific concerns that the Chinese, how are they're going to meddle in the affairs of India, whether it is the colonial Indian state or even in a subsequent, post-independence Indian state, they are going to give trouble to India because of the, solidifying of boundaries and, the making of claims. And so I would say that this was responsible for the, real increase in, Chinese intelligence and reporting, and the immediate post-war deportations, which Tansen has written about some of those kind of things. I think in the volume edited by Brian and Tansen, Tansen's chapter on the kind of persecution of individual Chinese that was there at the end of the war. So I feel it was more rooted in current nation states. Okay.
Yeah. So we have if Madhavi and Tashwini and other colleagues here would bear with me, we have 2 more questions on the chat box. One has to do with whether there's so this inter-regional competitions within China as to what claim they made on these Chinese seamen or the Chinese presence in India. That's one question. Chongqing government and other political actors in China. I assume that will also include the communists and other, the so-called more pro-Japanese collaborationist government based in Nanjing. And also the other question from Aparajit on whether you have information on Chinese personnel working in other institutions in India, particularly something that I've never heard of actually, Hindutan aircraft.
Yeah, maybe I'll take Aparajit's question first.
Yeah.
I have, this was, when I said there was an explosion of connections between China and India during this period, the Seamen is one type of thing that was happening, but the great increase in the connections between official sort of technical personnel, scientific personnel, technical personnel, and others coming from China to India, particularly in this period. I think this is one of the really beginning of a modern phase of a relationship between India and China. I would say that prior to the World War II, I mean, there was this, intellectual and a kind of emotional connect, Pan-Asianism, that kind of. But during World War II, there was really so many offices and agencies of China which were in India, because they needed that kind of support, and the British were kind of quite willing to do this kind of thing as an ally of China, help them to bring Chinese experts to India, not maybe to work in these institutions, more to learn from them and get some skills, get some knowledge, take it back to China. So this is I can't go into it in detail, we don't have much time, but this is something that is definitely there, in which I've also been trying to collect a lot of information. But it's unbelievable the number of agencies, Chinese, individual scientific and technical experts and all who were in India at this time. Okay, so
I see that Aparajit has unmuted his. Would you like to just briefly chip in?
No, I just wanted to say that's fascinating, and thank you so much. And maybe on another occasion,
maybe we
love to hear more about that. Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I think just this last one question to
the question on whether there was competition between different Chinese states, regional wars.
Yeah, I know this is a very complex question. I'm trying to read the lack.
Government in Nanjing, Wang Jingwei, and such of that. Yeah.
While you mentioned them. okay, a conflict between Chongqing government and other political actors in China. Do you have any? Oh, this is really that I think one has to mine the archives of the Academia Historica in Taiwan maybe to see that what the the kind of conflict within China between the different political actors in China and how that affected the Seamen and their understanding of their role. I really don't know about that. But if one does, which I hope to be able to access those files at some time, this is something that needs to be looked at. Right now, you said, do you have any thoughts on how this internal political conflict of China has impacted the Seamen's understanding of their role? Now, from what I can see from just the files that I have looked at here in the archives in India, their understanding of their role is really coming not so much from different political quarters, but from their self-identification as workers, as people who had certain rights, who signed a contract, are not getting what they wanted, don't want to be shunted off as coolies or as soldiers. And so this is the kind of picture that emerges from what I've seen so far. But this is definitely an aspect of which needs to be looked at. But I think I would have to look at the files in Taiwan to get a better idea of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Thampi. I think this is a very good end to our discussion. It sort of makes things open. So those of us who are into archives, who have access to archives, can go back to them and see if there are stuff that we can look back more to, as to probably, first of all, the question is how much this Chinese seamen were sort of influenced by the conflicting loyalties that were also that sort of plagued the Chinese polity at that time, and also the whole the issue of labor in sort of in the British labor, in the British Empire, sorry, where there's this the interaction between the Indian, for example, the local Calcutta laborers and the Chinese laborers, and laborers from probably from other parts of the world. When they congregate in a particular major port in the British Empire, how they sort of they were they able to sort of form some sort of solidarity, whether they sort of came into some sort of conflict. This is, I suppose, a topic that is, of course, specific to this period that Professor Thampi discussed for us in this evening, but also echoes the other locations and other periods that we historians wish to study in our project and other projects. So thank you, Professor Thampi, for your talk.
Thank you. I've got a lot of leads from these questions on how to take this research.
And would you like to add something before we end?
No, nothing much. But I wish I could. I was trying to jot down these questions, because really all those things which I couldn't really answer, these are things which need to be looked at, and where we get a more, a fuller picture of what is going on, what was really going on at that time.
I suppose Safik can help us cap the chat box, the questions that were put on the on the meeting chat, and there's also recording of the entire session.
Send that to me, I would be very grateful. I try to jot down, but just single words, so that'll help. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madhavi. Lovely to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a good evening, and I'll see you at the next the next talk. I think I will be responsible for giving the information. So I'll get back to Savik very soon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good evening. Bye bye. See you soon.